Right, George Groves versus Andrea Di Luisa. Before we get into it, this has actually turned out to be not the worst bill in the world. Some decent undercards, fights, should I say, on this bill. You got Tommy Martin versus John Wayne Hibbard. You've got John Ryder versus Sergei Kamitsky. Now, both of those are trade fights, but both of those are 50-50 style fights, and it's what the boxing fans should applaud. I'm looking forward to them, and if I get time tomorrow, I'm going to try and do videos on both of those fights, because I think they're good enough fights to deserve videos. To be honest, I've been quite busy, and I've got I need to do something on Sergey Kovalev versus John Pascal as well, so I may not have time, but if I can, I'm going to try and get videos up on those, because I think they're really, really good fights. I'm also going to try and do a live show on Saturday around lunchtime, with the option for people to call in to discuss the bill as a whole, because I think it's a real interesting fight. But anyway, let's talk about the main event. Let's talk George Groves versus Andrea Di Luisa. Now, before we get into George Groves and his comeback, let's talk Andrea Di Luisa. Now, his record, I believe, 18 wins, 3 losses. Of the 18 wins, 14 come by way of knockout. I did box check him earlier, so apologies if I've forgotten the numbers slightly, but I think that's right. His 3 losses, Muhammad Ali Ndai, who knocked him down 4 times en route to a 12-round decision. Christopher Brasse, that fight was stopped after 7 rounds. And Lucien Boutte, who stopped him in the 4th round. Now, I watched the Lucien Boutte fight. I haven't watched Di Luisa's back catalogue. I haven't sat down and spent time trawling through all the tape and all the footage of his old fights. So there'll be people out there who know more about him than I do. There are people who will have seen more than him than I do. But my opinion on him is formed from the Boutte fight, as well as 2 or 3 other clips that I've seen. So let me give you a brief breakdown of what I view Di Luisa as. I would say he is a relatively straightforward boxer type. Relatively orthodox in his approach. He fights quite classically, orthodox stance, likes to throw a 1-2, fights behind a jab, not overly wild. He's not someone you watch and you're left with a instant eye-catching impression. He doesn't do things amazingly well, he doesn't do things amazingly badly. He struck me as decent, respectable, but ultimately a bit average. In the Lucien Boutte fight, I thought, whilst it wasn't the most awe-inspiring performance from Boutte, I thought Boutte's all-round class really showed from the first bell against Di Luisa. For me, Boutte was just first to the punch. His jab, I know Boutte has obviously fought at a much, much higher level than Di Luisa, but the difference in the 2 guys' jabs were so obvious. Di Luisa's record, if you look at it, 18 wins, 14 by knockout, suggests that he could punch. But at this level, for me, his punches really seemed lacking. They seemed quite slow, actually. They lacked a bit of a snap to them. And he didn't look, I know it's always different when you're in there, but just watching the Boutte fight in tape, he didn't look very overly heavy-handed. I mean, don't get me wrong, there were 1 or 2 times he did catch Boutte, and, he did wake Boutte up a bit. He actually landed a decent punch on Boutte about 30 seconds before the stoppage came. So, the guy clearly has a little bit of power, but for me, he just looked his punches looked a bit slow, a bit cumbersome in there, and that kind of gave me the impression he wasn't the biggest puncher. I think one thing he did struggle with was the movement of Boutte. Boutte was able to kind of circle around him, and Di Luisa is slightly plodding on his feet from what I've seen on him. He kind of set his feet in front of Boutte, and what that meant is he really struggled to find his range. A lot of the time he's throwing a jab, because he fights behind a 1-2, and Boutte just keeps his hands up, and as Di Luisa jabs, Boutte almost catches the jab with his glove, and there were 2 reasons behind that. Firstly was the fact that his punch was a little bit slow. Secondly was because he was slightly plodding with his movement, and because Boutte was on his toes and moving around a bit, he really struggled to judge the range, I thought, Di Luisa. I mean, he threw a lot of jabs and a lot of straight punches that came up short. Even if Boutte hadn't bothered defending them, they'd have, the punch would have finished 6 inches in front of Boutte's face. because Bute's movement meant De Luisa wasn't judging the distance very well. As a result, he became fairly inaccurate in the fight. And, Bute's not always the easiest guy to hit, and at that sort of level, Bute's a very good fighter. But I thought his inaccuracy could be a problem against George Groves, because like Bute, George Groves can move nicely and can be quite elusive in the ring when he wants to be. The bigger worry for me, though, was the fact that De Luisa just isn't very strong defensively. Sometimes he has a tendency to put his hands low, but even more worryingly than that, sometimes he puts his hands up, but his guard is just way too open. I mean, time and time again, Lucien Bute was literally able to dissect his guard, because De Luisa's got his hands up like this, and Bute's glove is just coming through the guard and catching him. And against George Groves, you don't want to do that. I mean, Bute stopped him in 4. I know Bute can punch a bit, but he's not the hardest puncher in the division. Christopher Rebrasse is known as a relatively light puncher, and Rebrasse stopped him in 7. So I think De Luisa's punch resistance, combined with his lack of accuracy and potential defensive frailties, is going to be problematic for him in this fight. I think George Groves is going to be able to find gaps against him. I think George Groves' movement will give De Luisa problems. I think De Luisa will stand in front of George Groves a bit too much, he'll plant roots a bit too much, and I think he will struggle to hit George Groves, and I don't think it'll be long before George Groves stops him. I watched the press conference today. Groves looked in good shape. We'll see more at the weigh-in, but one thing Shane McGuigan is good at is getting fighters into good nick, it appears, and George Groves looked fit, he looked motivated, he's going to be back on Sky cameras, and I think this will be an early stoppage win. We got to be careful about George Groves, because comeback fights before, Rebrasse, Douglin, he's looked decidedly average. He hasn't really got up for them maybe, but I do think, based on what I've seen of George Groves in the past, he's got enough to stop De Luisa round 4, round 5, round 6. Those sort of rounds, and I'd be disappointed if De Luisa gives George Groves a tough night, because I think he's average. He's not bad. He does the basics all right, but he doesn't have any sort of X factor to his game. There's nothing he does overly well, and I think, as I say, I think he'll struggle to hit George Groves if Groves is on his game, and I think Groves will be able to cut through his defence. The way to beat George Groves, you can chin him. Well, I don't think De Luisa's got the power for that, really. Or you could test out his stamina over 12 rounds. And for me, the way De Luisa fights, kind of standing off opponents, throwing a jab, the way that he's been stopped early, I don't really see this being a grueling 12-round war for George Groves. I see Groves winning this with a little bit in hand. It's a sensible comeback fight. De Luisa's record numerically isn't bad, but some of the opposition he's beaten on his record is not much cop at all. And when he's stepped up in class, when he's fought the Christopher Rebrasses of this world, he's lost. And let's be honest, Christopher Rebrasses not a bad fighter by any stretch, but George Groves handled him. Callum Smith handled him. He's an awkward guy, but Groves and Smith beat him with quite a bit in hand. Whilst the fights were competitive, they weren't really close, were they? I mean, Groves and Smith won those fights by multiple rounds, and Rebrasse went out and was able to stop this guy. For me, De Luisa, he's just not got it to trouble George Groves here, and I expect George Groves to win. I did a video earlier in the week which was very critical of George Groves, saying that he was ruining his career through arrogance and through lack of accountability, and I stand by that. And in that video I did raise that George Groves has actually struggled in fights against the likes of Paul Smith, Kenny Anderson, Christopher Rebrasse. He struggled against guys who you would assume he'd be a league above. So I don't want to take it as too much of a given that this is going to be an easy fight. But one thing I would say about George Groves is I do believe he genuinely is a hard puncher. I mean, look at the way he dropped Carl Frotz. He stopped Paul Smith in 2 when Smith went the distance twice with Abraham and went late with De Gale and Andre Ward. I mean, Groves can punch, and this guy's defensively open. relatively stationary, and he's been stopped by lesser punchers. Let me know your thoughts. I'm predicting George Groves' stoppage early to mid rounds. A respectable comeback opponent, but not one that I see as overly competitive. Am I overestimating George Groves? Do you know more about Andrea Di Luisa? Leave your comments below. If you've enjoyed this video, please give me the thumbs up. I'd appreciate it. Do subscribe to the channel because I'm going to cover this fight. May do a video on the rest of the card, as I say, and certainly will do a post-fight video. Let me know your thoughts. Thanks for watching.